Tonight's presentation is about those Loyalists who were the ancestors of some of you here this evening, the Loyalist pioneers of Rawdon Township. This presentation is in 3 parts. The first part is an overview of the Loyalists, who they were, what they represented, their impact on Nova Scotia, and so on. The second part will briefly consider the impact of the Loyalist migration on Hants County, and more specifically on East Hants. Earlier discussions of the Loyalists presented to the Society were centered around the 84th Regiment and Douglas Township. Tonight we'll give special place to the Rawdon Township Loyalists. The third part, presented by our President and Chair, Pat Whidden, is about a Loyalist refugee immigrant soldier whose story is shrouded in mystery. Part 1. An overview of the Loyalists. You are hereby notified to depart, as you were considered an enemy to your country. Therefore take your all, and your family, and follow your friends to that country that the King, your master, has provided for those of your character. By such words, people like your ancestors were informed that they were persona non grata, undesirables, and were exiled from the land of their birth or choice and forced to leave. These were the Loyalists, and some 100 men, women, and children fled from the territory that became the United States of America. Their exodus began in 1976, when General William Howe evacuated Boston and brought 1,100 exiles to Halifax. By the end of the war, some 35,000 new settlers arrived in Nova Scotia, overwhelming the old population of 20,000 with unprecedented demands for land and services. Their arrival caused the creation of 2 new Atlantic colonies, New Brunswick and Cape Breton, both in 1784, and, as you see on the map, in 1791, the new colony of Upper Canada, or Ontario. As you see from the return of the disbanded troops and Loyalists settling in Nova Scotia and mustered in 1784, it gives you an idea of the settlements that were created as a result of the Loyalist migration, including a number in Hants County and in the areas around it. And in fact, it opened up parts of the province that had previously been unsettled since the days of the Acadians. The Loyalists have been given an almost mythic status in at least eastern Canada, and especially in the Maritime provinces. The Loyalists were the founders of many new communities in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton Island. They were lauded for their consistency and praised for their willingness to give up everything except their principles. Conversely, the Loyalists, or Tories as they were called in the lower 13 colonies, were the villains in American history. Contemporary definitions of Loyalists are often not very complimentary. One proclaimed that a Tory is a thing whose head is in England, its body in America, and its neck ought to be stretched. Another insisted that while every fool is not a Tory, yet every Tory is a fool. Ignoring such partisan descriptions, the Tories, the Loyalists, unorganized and less united, were simply those who remained actively or passively loyal to King George III and opposed the Declaration of Independence, even if they'd taken a Whig position earlier. Prior to 1763, indeed prior to 1773, it would likely have been impossible to distinguish future rebel from future Loyalist. Most colonials would no doubt have denied that such an eventuality as independence was desirable, let alone possible. Yet by 1783, independence was a reality. However, it should be emphasized that up to the 4th of July, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence, the Loyalists were every bit as American as their Whig brethren, and one looks in vain for Loyalists who were opposed to liberty or the rights of Englishmen. The great majority did not even favor the new English legislation after the 7 Years' War. The quarrel was over the mode of opposition. The Loyalists believed the future of their country would be ruined by revolution and independence. It was not a case of colonial rights or passive disobedience, but rather whether the colonials' future well-being could be best assured within the empire or outside of the empire. The Loyalists had a fundamental trust in Britain, the Whigs a fundamental distrust. Historian Wallace Brown pointed out that the majority of the Loyalists never left America in the first place, but became reassimilated into American life after the hostilities were over. However, by that time, some 100,000 Loyalists had become political exiles. Authorities estimate that there were 24 émigrés per thousand in the American Revolution and only 5 per thousand of population in the French Revolution. Only by such comparisons can the true upheaval of the American Revolutionary War be demonstrated. The American Revolution was, above all, a civil war, one that tore communities and families apart, and it was often safer to leave than to stay. Loyalist homes were attacked, their jobs made forfeit, and all legal action was denied them. From 1777, the states began the practice of banishing prominent Loyalists, and everywhere they ran the risk of tar and feathers. Beaten, robbed, and sometimes murdered, the greatest trials of many Loyalists came not with their struggles to start over in a new land, but prior to their exile from the old. Peace didn't necessarily bring reconciliation. Men had learned to hate their brothers, and fathers their sons. Some of you will remember the road sign pointing the way to the Loyalist city of St. John, New Brunswick, featuring a man dressed in a blue frock coat with ruffles at the sleeve and throat and wearing a tri-cornered hat. For many, that became the visual representation of a Loyalist. Traditionally, they were identified with the upper classes of American society. The Loyalists, however, were not class-bound, but rather came from every avenue of colonial life. A majority were farmers or landowners, and therefore rural residents. A sizable minority, however, were in commerce or a profession, or held an official position, and accordingly they usually lived in towns, most of which were on the coast. Artisans, merchants, servants, shopkeepers, innkeepers, laborers, seamen, lawyers, doctors, clergymen, and office holders were all represented in the Loyalist ranks. There were more who were poor than rich, and colonial minorities were overrepresented. These minorities included religious groups like the Quakers and Mennonites, native peoples such as the Mohawk Nation that moved into Canada, and racial groups like the approximately 3,000 to 3,500 Black Loyalists who came to Nova Scotia. The Loyalists left an area that was geographically immense, with a relatively small population. While 9/10 of the people lived in the countryside, there were 5 major cities. The most easterly parts of the colonies enjoyed the pleasures of civilized life. Although distrusted by the frontier, eastern colonial centers were culturally sophisticated centers containing libraries, newspapers, and learned societies. They boasted 9 universities, and in general, their education laws were relatively liberal. The journeys of the Loyalists began from all corners of the colonies. In real numbers, the greatest Loyalist colony was New York, followed by South Carolina, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Connecticut, Virginia, Georgia, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Delaware. Their destinations were equally diverse. Some fled to England, others to Florida, Bermuda, and the West Indies. The largest single destination, however, was into what remained of Great Britain's North American colonies. By ship they traveled to the Maritimes and Quebec, while others on foot or by ox cart or hand cart entered British territory to settle in what's now Ontario and Quebec. When the Loyalists left their old homes, they carried much more than their loyalty with them. They also brought their cultural, educational, legal, political, and religious values. You see by this map and the accompanying information a variety of the communities where Loyalists settled in Nova Scotia, and you see again how the communities that were created spread right across the province. Their numbers created communities like Shelburne, that was for a short time the 4th largest English-speaking city in North America. Loyalist religious demands caused the creation of the first colonial bishoprics and the growth of various Christian denominations. The Loyalist educational concerns led to the establishment of universities throughout the colonies. The creation of newspapers, magazines, and a new elite also marked the Loyalist presence in their new homes. Their active participation in political affairs, often in opposition, underlies the fact that while they were undoubtedly loyal, they were not lackeys of government. In their response to their new circumstances, they soon mirrored much of that they had left behind. In their struggle to survive the first years, the Loyalists likely suffered no more hardship than did the earlier or later pioneers who helped develop this country. The Loyalists have been described as a worthy people, not very different from the Americans who had preceded them and the Americans who followed them, except they had an exceptional reputation for loyalty, which may have led some of them to claim a monopoly of this virtue. While this estimation may well be accurate, there remains no doubt that the Loyalists can lay a legitimate claim on history for a place of their own. American historian Charles Andrews pointed out that a revolutionist who is unsuccessful is likely to be condemned as a criminal, whereas he who succeeds is sure to be dubbed as a patriot, a statesman, a hero, or a saint. It is always too much for human nature to glorify the losing side. However, this has been the lot of the Loyalists. A loser as far as the war was concerned, a Tory, a traitor, a villain as far as the victors were concerned, the Loyalists became the patriots, heroes, and saints of Canada's early history. While no doubt that as individuals they possess a combination of both the good and bad qualities ascribed to them, it is equally certain that they had all lost much for their Tory principles, and likewise believed that they were a chosen people, a feeling that did not die with the first generation of Loyalists. It may be best to see the Loyalists as individuals, not as heroes or villains, but simply as individuals facing the public and private affairs of their lives as best they could. As individuals, their hardships, sufferings, and heartaches take on a new form and a new reality. As neighbors parted and families split, there were heartaches that did not mend, even when political attitudes softened between the former foes. Part 2. The Loyalists of Rawdon Township. Just as the old provincial borders of Nova Scotia were reconfigured due to the arrival of the Loyalists, so too were its internal political boundaries. Hants County was created on the 17th of June, 1781, out of part of Kings County on the petition of local residents who made it clear that the distance from Horton, the county town of Kings County, and the inconvenience of crossing Avon River to transact county business were the factors which prompted the inhabitants of the towns of Windsor, Falmouth, and Newport to desire to be formed into a separate county. New settlements demanded organization, political recognition, and representation. One of the new districts was the township of Rawdon. In 1784, on 3rd September and 4th September respectively, official registration of the townships of Douglas and Rawdon occurred. Rawdon Township, it was noted, was created for the Loyalists from 96 District, South Carolina, and St. Augustine, Florida. These political arrangements remained unaltered until 1861, when the provincial government divided the county into two districts, called East Hants and West Hants. The legislation carefully delineated the townships that would be part of West Hants, and concluded that East Hants shall include all the remaining portions of the county of Hants. The municipality of the district of East Hants was established in accord with the 1879 legislation that created municipal units of governance in Nova Scotia. The story of the Rawdon Loyalist settlers originated in the Bloody War, fought in South Carolina, over 1,600 miles, 2,600 kilometers, and one time zone to the south and west of Nova Scotia. Look to the bottom of the map, not just above Florida and Georgia. Wallace Brown points out that South Carolina possessed in Charleston the only real city of the South, and that the Stamp Acts of 1765 and the later Intolerable Acts were strongly opposed in South Carolina, and in January 1775 a provincial congress met in Charleston and royal government rapidly disappeared with hardly any protest. Brown also provides a brief overview of the military action in South Carolina, writing, "In June 1776, the Patriots beat off a British attack on Charleston, and at the same time defeated the pro-British Cherokee on the border. The South remained secure for nearly 3 years until May 1780, when the British captured or recaptured Charleston. In August, the British beat the Patriot force at the Battle of Camden and secured the upcountry. But partisans continued to harass the British and Tories in a bitter civil war, and finally the Patriot victory at Kings Mountain in October 1780 turned the tide, although it was not until December 1782 that Charleston was evacuated. Britt is more graphic in his description of the times, writing under the heading, "The Civil War Bloodies the Carolinas." And you note in the timeline of the war in the South that's on the screen a number of the events from July 1776 through to 1784. And in the middle there you see of the Charleston surrenders to the British, and then the siege of 96 and the other events that occurred there in South Carolina. Description of the war, he states that neighbor disputed neighbor, some families changed sides, raids, reprisals, and abductions marked the revolution in the South, one of the most vicious partisan wars ever waged. Loyalists cheered when Britain's Sir Henry Clinton, lured by promises of Southern support, stormed Charleston, South Carolina, and General George Cornwallis captured inland fortifications. Patriots rallied as their leader, General Horatio Gates, pushed south, but at Camden, South Carolina, and you'll find Camden on the map, Gates lost his army and his reputation in a battle that pitted Carolinians against each other. The tide turned again when Patriot General Nathanael Greene recaptured outposts until only a fortified South Carolina town called 96 remained. Greene and 1,000 men in May 1781 laid siege to the Star Fort that guarded the town. The Loyalists held out for 28 days until reinforcements arrived. Then the British, realizing they could not hold the backcountry, burned the town and withdrew to Charleston. Inside the fortification in the town of 96 were the Loyalist militiamen and civilians who eventually came to Nova Scotia, and the 26-year-old British general who lifted the siege was Lord Francis Rawdon, whose picture you see. Among the South Carolinians who had sought refuge in the fort was a young farmer named John Bond. It's not clear why Bond chose to be a Loyalist. In fact, Bond stayed out of the war until the British captured the upcountry following their capture of Charlestown in 1780. At this point, neutrality was virtually impossible. Bond and his family sought the protection of the British at Fort 96, in common with hundreds of non-revolutionaries in the area. Some of the men coming into the fort had been neutral so far, while others had actively opposed the revolution. Still others had supported it, but now changed sides, gambling on a British victory. All of the men coming into the fort were expected to serve in the local militia, and Bond did so. In the earliest muster rolls listing him, his rank is private. He rose to the rank of captain at Fort 96. Leadership, such as provided by Bond, was necessary at the defense of Fort 96, manned by 550 Loyalists. Theirs was a desperate defense, for the killing, rape, house burning, and plunder on both sides called for revenge. The siege of 96 was lifted when the rebels heard that Lord Rawdon's forces were approaching. Rawdon was at the fort only long enough to have it evacuated. The evacuees eventually gathered at Charleston in company with hundreds of others, where, Duncanson says, that the Loyalists from 96 were housed in a hut village they named Rawdon. 15 months would pass before the British evacuated the city. For the people who would go to Nova Scotia's Rawdon, it was 15 months of refugee existence while they weighed their alternatives. For some, the alternative was to return to 96 District, but for persons who did not return to their homes, Army transport ships would take them to Jamaica, East Florida, Nova Scotia, New York, and St. Lucia. The nucleus of the Rawdon settlement were among the 501 who boarded the transports for Halifax. After landing in Halifax in late 1782, some of the 501 went to Shelburne, while others went to what would later become New Brunswick. Still others moved to a place referred to as near Windsor, which would become Rawdon, some 40 miles, 64 kilometers north of Halifax. Rawdon's founders arrived in the upland between the Kennecook and Herbert Rivers in 3 movements between 1783 and 1788. In February 1783, the first Rawdon settlers moved north to Windsor and Newport to be nearer the surveyed tract of wilderness. By the time the warrant to survey was issued in June 1784, they had cut a road and moved to the area which they called Rawdon. There were 28 families and 27 single men. In the summer of 1784, the first group was joined by 10 more men, 6 of them with families, just arrived from the evacuation of East Florida. The East Florida arrivals were from the same general area as the first Rawdon settlers. Most of them were personally known by the leaders of the settlement, who had helped them apply for land. Thereafter, Rawdon continued to attract exiles from the southern backcountry, most of them arriving by 1788. Those later arrivals were already in Nova Scotia and chose to join others from the southern backcountry of South Carolina, who dominated the Rawdon settlement. By 1788, 74 southern backcountry men and widows had received grants. Although most of them had families, there were not 74 households. Teenage boys also received grants. There were 53 surnames among the grantees. John Bond emerged as the leader of the Rawdon settlers, and he held a key leadership role for the rest of his life. In June 1783, he was made deputy surveyor for the purpose of laying out a grant to the settlers, who were referred to in the warrant as John Bond and the other associated Loyalists from South Carolina. While it has been suggested that Bond was given the responsibility of the office because he was a militia captain, he was not the only militia officer among the Rawdon settlers. Like Bond, among others, William Meek was a captain, and Zachariah Gibbs and Thomas Pearson were colonels, so Bond was not even the ranking officer. Obviously, his being an officer was not the only quality that convinced the Halifax authorities that he should receive the appointment. He was also consistently dedicated to the Rawdon settlement. Although Gibbs left Rawdon late in 1792 and never returned, and William Meek disappeared from Rawdon at about the same time as Gibbs, and Thomas Pearson remained in Nova Scotia, though not at Rawdon, Bond stayed in Rawdon. During their time together in Rawdon, however, they seem to have worked well together. Bond, Meek, Gibbs, and Pearson were appointed justices of the peace and frequently served as road commissioners. Bond was also a blacksmith and built both a sawmill and a gristmill on the Herbert River, shown here. Bond's home served as a local point in its immediate vicinity, the neighborhood which in the 19th century would be known as Centre Rawdon. A similar settlement cluster, eventually called South Rawdon, grew up around Meek's land. The land grants in Rawdon Township were significantly larger than those in most other Loyalist settlements in Nova Scotia, with 250 acres for a family and 500 acres for a family, I believe, with an officer. Larger grants were given to officers, and Bond decided who got which grant. After the grants were made, the settlers' first concern was to build houses for their families and shelters for their livestock. Opening the land for crops and pasture then took precedent, as the support of the British government would only be extended for a few brief years. Roads had to be built to replace the blazed trails, especially to connect with the all-important Halifax-Windsor route, and then another to the Loyalist settlements established in the neighboring township of Douglas by the 84th Regiment. Churches were built, and houses of some sort were established. During the 1790s, most of the Loyalist communities in Nova Scotia faced a loss of residents due to dashed expectations and outmigration. Some individuals and families moved elsewhere in Nova Scotia, while others left the province. But there was also an in-migration to Rawdon Township that in part compensated for those who left. The Loyalist pioneer settlers who established Rawdon clearly put their stamp on it. 240 years later, their mark, as evidenced by the persistence of family names and blood ties and bloodlines, is still there. We now turn to part 3, and this is being presented by Pat Whidden, and she has a story about a Loyalist who has disappeared.
David Densmore was a Loyalist refugee from South Carolina. His name appears on the muster rolls of Zachariah Gibbs Regiment in the Spartan Militia of 96th Brigade in 1780 and 1781. Other than to see his name on a land grant in Rawdon Township, I knew nothing about him until here's the backstory. A few years ago, I attended a workshop on surname studies, and at the end of the session, I left my two names, Layton, my dad's name, and Densmore, my mother's name. Some weeks later, I received an email forwarded to me from a Bill Lindsay of Arkansas, wondering if his David Densmore was any relation to my James Densmore, the first Densmore to arrive in Nova Scotia with his family. He was able to do enough research to learn that David had got his original land grant, 100 acres in the South Rawdon, Mount Uniacke area, sold it. This is where it's located here, and you can see the location, Lewis Lake, Uniacke Mines. Sold it almost immediately and bought a property in Knoll Shore from a William Densmore, who was James's son. However, he couldn't find any evidence that David had sold it, and he had no idea what had become of his ancestor. He was pretty certain he had not returned to South Carolina, as the family farm was eventually sold, with the grantors being David's wife and one of his sons, not David. The Densmore grant in Knoll Shore was 1,500 acres, granted in 1764, although it wasn't until the early 1770s that James and his sons arrived there. On this map, you can see the grant marked out here, 1,500 acres, and I've marked off the location of the 300 acres that David Densmore bought from William, just up the hill from where my mother's family still lives. And that's where the property transfer trail went cold. That land had been subdivided a number of times, and a lot of different people had lived on it and worked it over the years since the American Revolution, but there was no evidence to show that David Densmore had transferred ownership to anyone else. Also, no evidence that he had remained in the area. No church records, no burials, no children, nothing. It wasn't until last year, totally by accident, that I stumbled on at least part of a solution. I had been asked to search for property ownerships of Scottish residents in the Belknap and Enfield area. And in the course of doing so, I brought up a Mackenzie name with a half-dozen property transactions. Not necessarily the same man, just the same name. I found the one I was looking for, and then I thought I should check the others just to make sure I wasn't missing something. And what did I find? A conveyance from a Kenneth Mackenzie to Donald Mackenzie in Douglas Township by and adjoining Mungo Creek. And it was the Mungo Creek reference that caught me. Here was the complete line of property conveyance from James Densmore to David Densmore to a Peter Hall, and from there to Kenneth Mackenzie. Now I had a name I could input to track back the conveyance between Peter Hall and David Densmore. And this is what I found. David mortgaged the property to Peter Hall, who was located in Windsor, for the sum of £20. The reason the transaction had not shown up in my earlier searches was because whoever transcribed the mortgage to the registry spelled David's name wrong, Insmore, not Densmore, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner. Hard to say why. Could have been too much curlicue in the writer. Some of it was pretty florid back then, or it may have been some other reason. I'm leaning toward the original document being really hard to read, because if you look further down in the highlighted bit close to the bottom, you can see that the northern boundary of the property is Copper Gate Bay, and it really should be Cobequid Bay. So language got in the way of accuracy, I think. Bill Lindsay in Arkansas was thrilled when I emailed him to tell him the news. However, we still don't know what happened to David. Did he join a ship's crew and sail away? Maybe. Did he sneak back to the south under cover and move with the family when they went to Kentucky? Not likely, as there would be some mention of it within the family. Perhaps he took his £20 and forfeited the property to go somewhere else, maybe in Nova Scotia. We don't know, but one wonders if there were not other Loyalist David Densmore stories out there as well.